Good evening and welcome to the Heterodox History Podcast. Today's presentation by popular demand, after a very close poll in which over 1,000 of you voted, is the Tokugawa Shogunate, Feudalism Perfected. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. If any audience members have questions to put to me, remember to leave a comment prefaced with @Apostolic Majesty towards the end of the presentation. As the presentation draws to a close, I will send out a reminder. If you wish to guarantee that I will answer your question, please send a super chat. Any donations are greatly appreciated and make the work of this channel possible. Thank you. I originally embarked on this topic wanting to draw attention to the peculiar success of the early modern, in quotes, political system of Japan, even going as far as to call the Tokugawa Shogunate the most successful government ever. The idea that the Tokugawa Shogunate could claim this mantle may come as a shock to some of you with a passing familiarity with the subject matter, who associate Tokugawa rule with narrow-mindedness, sakoku or closed borders, authoritarianism to the point of characterizing the Japan of the 17th and 18th centuries as a prison colony. Overall, the impression, the superficial impression that is of an age of stagnation, an arrested society, the antithesis of the rapid industrialization and expansion that typified the age succeeding it, the Meiji era. It is the framework of this clash of the industrial and pre-industrial worlds that causes me to row back slightly on the idea of Tokugawa Japan as representing the most successful government ever. As to us moderns, the idea is so impenetrable to be almost inconceivable. Within its proper context, in terms of both time and place, I have instead settled on this idea that Japan had perfected the system of feudalism, that is, a governmental form dependent on reciprocal and personal obligations between warrior elites and the estates or classes that comprised any realm, from the word fief or holding, a possession bestowed to be held in trust. Perfect feudalism? Surely the idea that feudalism in any of its manifestations, from England to Japan with all of its idiosyncrasies, could represent perfection is a contradiction in terms, especially to an Enlightenment mindset. In order to qualify this, we cannot think in terms of utopianism, irrespective of the ideology fixed to it. The idea is a contradiction in terms, as its literal meaning signifies utopia, no place. Moreover, it is pure anathema to graft a materialistic worldview, and with it material qualifiers such as gross domestic product and material equality, onto a civilization that was defined by its relationship to the transcendent, and treated the material world in practical terms at best, and with outright moral condemnation at worst. The overriding temporal concern of the medieval mindset, I use that term guardedly, was with the common weal, or kogi as its closest approximation in Japan, the peace of the realm, the king's peace, the interconnectivity and the reciprocal relationship between all the classes. The fact that the Edo period of Japan, Edo coming from the capital of the Tokugawa shogunate, is used interchangeably with the Great Tokugawa Peace is testament to the success of the shogunate in this area. Peace here is meant domestically, as a just external war is not always at odds with internal peace. Rather, war from without often facilitated peace within, as was the case with the 100 Years' War in France or the Korean campaigns of the Japanese regent or Taiko, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The fact that the Edo period witnessed both internal and external peace for a quarter of a millennium stands out as all the more remarkable. Nor should this peace be confused with pacifism or peace at all costs. Peace here is predicated on the preservation of an unbroken link, a civilizational force or essence transmitted since prehistory, or in the case of Europe, the maintenance of true Christianity. In other words, a temporal peace that could facilitate spiritual cultivation and or heavenly salvation, as the core values of a nation are upheld as sacred. In the Japanese case, this meant the maintenance of a particular Buddhist, Shinto, Confucian hybridism, while the geography of Japan itself represented the sacred land of the gods. Subversion was only tolerated insofar as countering subversion imperiled the peace. In Europe, where feudalism endured into the 17th and 18th century, such as within the Holy Roman Empire, peace, or in Germany, the German liberty, came at the expense of religious unity, nor was the peace, or the Westphalian peace, very successful. In France, religious disunity was remedied by political absolutism. Put simply, where the state, in the case of France, the state as embodied in the king, possessed a monopoly of violence, as opposed to feudalism, where military power is decentralized. Japan was at peace, while Europe endured centuries of conflict. Japan effectively countered religious subversion, principally from Catholic Christianity, while retaining its decentralized, hierarchical feudal structure. This, all the while developing a sophisticated, prosperous, and literate urban culture, which made 18th century Edo, modern day Tokyo, one of the world's greatest and most populous cities. While outwardly, Europe honed its destructive capabilities through centuries of trial, the comparative simplicity or backwardness of Japanese life only masked the considerable changes of the Edo period, changes that ensured that when the West directly confronted Japan, Japan would be sufficiently equipped to undergo the necessary transformation to meet this existential threat. Tokugawa Japan is thus a prelude to, and not the antithesis, of the Meiji period. With these qualifiers established, I should explain how the Tokugawa Shogunate, this uniquely Japanese expression of government, represents a superlative form of feudalism in the context of Japanese history and with deference to wider world history. In conceiving of harmonious political order in Japan, I turn your attention to the early diffusion of Confucianism, and here I'm reading an excerpt from Marius Jansen's The Making of Modern Japan, which I've linked to the purchase options in the description. The political scientist Masao once characterized Confucianism as a set of categories through which people saw their world. In Tokugawa times, those categories began with loyalty. They went on to include filiality, obligation, duty, harmony, and diligence. These values were, of course, exclusively Confucian. Few civilizations think poorly of those qualities, but for Japanese, they were phrased in Confucian terms and examples. They spoke in terms of the 5 relationships: ruler-subject, father-son, husband-wife, elder-younger, and friend-to-friend, and struggled for a rectification of names that would enable the individual to live up to the responsibilities that accompanied the realization of this position in this structure of relationships. Self-cultivation was essential to the moral life and the key to social order and harmony. These teachings were embedded in the Confucian classics and reinforced by primers of moral guidance that came flooding from the printing press. As they made rulers better rulers and the ruled easy to rule, they undergirded the authority structure of society and had the full support of the Tokugawa administrators. Even so, it was not an exclusively one-way process, for there was also assumed a basic reciprocity involved. Some have even described this as a covenant. The moral posture of those above, shown in benevolence, could evoke an obligation from those below, but in turn the respectful cooperation of the ruled imposed the obligation to be just on those above. The network of relationships that resulted extended throughout society and included ruler and ruled, master and servant, landlord and tenant, and of course, lord and vassal. These were obligations on both sides. Teachings of this sort were basically this worldly, temporal, and rational. They did not require and did not receive sanctions or rewards of supernatural forces for their implementation. Yet there was also a spiritual cultivation involved. Self-cultivation and search for morality, like that for Buddhahood or Zen illumination, struck a responsive chord in Japanese tradition and expressed a truth that common to the Buddhist and Shinto traditions as well as to Confucianism. Confucian thought had entered Japan much earlier as part of the stream of Chinese influence that included Buddhism. One of the first documents, the 17th century Constitution of Prince Shotoku, contains a mixture of both teachings and is in fact almost a dialogue between them. Learning for court aristocrats was based on Confucian texts. At the same time, the Buddhist worldview dominated the Japanese court. Confucianism represented a constant intellectual tradition in Japanese political life, undergirding the structure of authority not just of the Tokugawa shogunate, but of the regimes that preceded it, in what amounts to a millennia of political experimentation with varying levels of deference to continental, mainly Chinese currents. In testament to the legacy of China, Tokugawa-era Japan consisted of two authorities, the shogunate, martial and administrative, and the imperial court, spiritual and cultural. A Japan first conceived in Chinese Confucian terms envisaged a preeminent role for the latter without even recognizing the former. From the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, chronicles of Japanese history, Imperial Japan had a 1,000-year period of legendary history, commencing with the first Emperor Jimmu, which, according to the Christian calendar, would be in the 7th century BC. Where legend ends and history begins is not a settled question, but for the sake of this conversation, let us focus on the verifiable reign of the Emperor Kinmei in the 6th century AD. Kinmei's reign saw the introduction of Buddhism to Japan. Otherwise, in China, centuries of political division following the demise of the Han dynasty was finally ended by the Sui, who were quickly superseded by the Tang dynasty, arguably the greatest of all the dynasties of China relative to other world civilizations at that time. During the cultural hegemony of the 7th century Tang, Japan, under the conscious leadership of the imperial courtier, or Taisho Kan Fujiwara no Kamatari, implemented the Taika reform of 645 that transformed the Japanese sovereign into an equivalent or imitation of the Chinese Huangdi, or Son of Heaven, and with it a centralized, state-administered civil service, a Confucian scholarly bureaucracy. Through the 8th and 9th centuries, or through the Nara period in Japan, Japan would establish a new capital, Heian-kyo, later Kyoto, modeled on the great Tang capital of Chang'an, and the era associated with it as Heian or peace, which lasted until the 12th century. Returning to Jansen and the development of the Confucian tradition in Japan as China transitioned from Tang to Song dynasties. During the medieval centuries, learning had survived chiefly in monastic establishments, and it was Buddhist scholars who preserved the Confucian tradition. Then and later, Buddhist pilgrims to China brought back the Sung scholarship of the 12th century Confucian scholar Chu His. Chu His, a contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas in Europe, had encased Confucian teachings in Taoist and Buddhist metaphysics to found a powerful synthesis. Moral principles were now described as the reflection of higher universal principles that led up to the supreme ultimate of cosmic metaphysics. New emphasis was placed on the investigation of things for study of the particular that could lead the seeker to comprehend universal principles. By extension, this could also be extended to the principles of the authority structure. Self-cultivation, requisite to sincerity, would best equip ruler and subject alike to fulfill their proper relationships. Adherence to them produced harmony between individual and the cosmos. It was a demanding search, and Neo-Confucianism sometimes developed a religious and confessional dimension in the search for an attainment of truth. For many, the encounter with the writings of Chu His marked a pivotal point in the personal development that approached Zen enlightenment. Sung dynasty Confucianism provided a powerful synthesis and ideology for early modern China and Korea. In China, the civil service examinations offered a social and political reward for demonstrated talent, and the writings of the Sun scholars became official truth. In Korea too, although admission to the examinations was increasingly limited to special social ranks of the so-called Yangban, similar sanctions and rewards obtained. However, at the outset of the Taika reform in Japan, Japanese particularism worked to subvert a direct imitation of Chinese-style political principles. Rather, Japan was able to develop a unique political system, recontextualizing Confucian principles, outstanding when one considers Korea's indebtedness to China and the fact that the conquerors of China, such as the Jershans, the Mongols, and the later Jershans or Manchus, were assimilated into the Chinese political system. Remember the name of the instigator of the Taika reforms, Taishokan Fujiwara no Kamatari. Kamatari was also the founder of the Fujiwara clan. Beginning as loyal vassals of the Imperial House of Japan, by the 9th century, Fujiwara clan members regularly intermarried with the Imperial House, and throughout the 10th century, the clan represented the largest landowners in Japan. By the year 1000, the Fujiwara clan had effectively privatized the administration of Japan and held the title of Daijo Daijin, or Chancellor of the Realm, as a hereditary office. Extra-imperial rule, tantamount to a permanent regency, was thus established as a pervading principle of Japanese political life, though it manifest in various different ways. Emperors, discontented with this state of affairs, would regularly abdicate and retire to a monastery. The abdicated emperor, in a bizarre paradox, affiliated with the formidable power of the Buddhist temples, free from the stifling ceremony of the imperial court that served as a form of intentional political paralysis, and master now of his own estates, could wield more power than a reigning emperor. This became so common that there is even a word for it in Japanese, insei, or cloistered rule. The Fujiwara clan thus subverted the very model of Chinese imperial rule that they had helped bring about. As a consequence, Japan had effected a reversal of Chinese history. China had begun as a decentralized, loosely described as feudal entity, until it was united by Qinchu Huangdi, who centralized power in the person of the emperor under the principle of legalism, that term would better approximate to Westerners as autocracy. Even as various dynasties rose and fell in accordance with the notion of heaven's mandate bestowed or rescinded, each subsequent dynasty, from the Han to the Qing, maintained a various iterational version of this system. In Japan, the imperial house remained, but its authority collapsed into a loose conglomeration of authorities from the shoen, or manorial estates of noble clans, to monastic temples. Without a monopoly of force, noble retainers assumed a preeminent role on the basis of military service to their respective lords. These were the samurai, from the word suborafu, to serve. By the 12th century, the Fujiwara usurpers were themselves usurped by a rival family, though this only served to weaken the imperial court all the more as noble coalitions formed, often claiming a hereditary right to rule through the demonstration or fabrication of illustrious lineages. This period of civil war was ended when the Minamoto clan, or Minamoto Yoritomo, established preeminence, and that of over all the samurai in Japan, but this also represented a samurai conquest of power. Power was no longer defined by proximity to the court, but through the principle that might makes right. To cement this transfer from civilian to warrior rule, the office of shogun, a title bestowed by the court in times of war with the Aino of Ezo Hokkaido in the north, shogun literally meaning northern barbarian subduing generalissimo, and thus comparable, say, with the medieval office of Constable of France, became the title of Japan's hereditary military dictator. As the line of the first Minamoto shogun Yoritomo became extinct, power was held by a hereditary line of shinkens, or regents from another clan, the Hojo. Hence why this period is commonly referred to as the Kamakura period, after the shogunal capital, rather than as the Minamoto shogunate. In a complete parody of the Chinese imperial system, Japan's powerless emperors were dominated by nominal military dictators who were in turn puppeted by their Hojo regents. This seemingly absurd shadow system within a shadow system of government survived throughout the 13th century until its great test against the Mongol Chinese invasions of Kublai Khan. Although Japan emerged successful, the Kamakura system was never able to adequately compensate for its lack of legitimacy, and its end was brought about by a war between an emperor bent on restoring imperial authority and a new warrior clan intent on subduing the emperor and superseding the Kamakura government. The new warrior government, the Ashikaga shogunate, was intent on eliminating the faults of the Kamakura system. The Ashikaga assumed formal paramountcy over all the warrior lineages as Buke non Toyo, and under Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the Ashikaga presented themselves in their diplomatic correspondence as the kings of Japan. This, despite shogunal control never exceeding the area around Kyoto, which was now both the shogunal and the imperial capital. To match his pretensions, Yoshimitsu attempted to rival, even eclipse, the imperial court in his patronage of culture. Nevertheless, the fragile compromise that brought the Ashikaga to power on the back of a coalition of warrior families to prevent a potential restoration of imperial rule quickly faltered after Yoshimitsu's death. Ashikaga power was unable to stop a civil war among the warrior class, the Onin War, while Japan became infamous as a pirate haven, the infamous Waku raiders. Again from Jansen. The Onin War began a long conflagration that effectively ended Ashikaga influence and rule. Japanese familiar with Chinese history referred to the era as Sengoku, the age of the warring states that had preceded China's unitary empire. If the influence of the shogun was at a low ebb, so was that of the imperial court. In 1500, a new emperor, Go Kashiwabara, had to wait 20 years for formal enthronement because funds were lacking. Not one of the Ashikaga shoguns of the 16th century served out his term without being driven from Kyoto at least once, and only one to die in his capital was murdered there. Real power was beginning to lie with regional commanders, who were consolidating their holdings and followers while their betters fought amongst themselves to a standstill at the centre. These regional commanders Jansen refers to are the daimyo, local lords who consolidated vast domains and boasted retinues of thousands of samurai. Though often presenting their local rule to Kyoto as a fait accompli, it was expedient for these upstart warlords to show deference to the pathetic central authority in Kyoto as a tentative means of legitimation in an age characterized by constant warfare, betrayal, and the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, as emblemized by such horrific practices, such as the Sujigiri, in complete contradiction to ostensibly Confucian principles. The rise of the daimyos corresponded with Japan's first interaction with the West. Coming aboard Wako pirate ships, Jesuit missionaries began propagating the Catholic faith from the westerly isle of Kyushu. The arrival of the Westerners, or Nanban, introduced the matchlock firearm, or iron arms, into Japan, dramatically changing the face of samurai warfare and serving as an indispensable tool for Japan's first unifier, Oda Nobunaga. While Tokugawa Ieyasu was the first Tokugawa shogun, he is typically referenced as the third unifier of Japan. The achievement of the Tokugawa and the facilitation of the Great Tokugawa Peace was a cumulative effort of three great men, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, off the back of the technological and political developments of the 16th century. A famous aphorism goes as follows. Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa were watching a cuckoo bird, waiting for it to sing, but the bird wouldn't sing. Nobunaga said, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will kill you." Hideyoshi says, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I'll make you sing." Then Tokugawa Ieyasu says to the bird, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will wait for you to sing." In essence, the aphorism is correct, as it is also correct to say that Ieyasu's remarkable rise owes as much to luck as to his patience. Nobunaga was the son of a relatively obscure warlord from Nagoya in Owari province. Hideyoshi emerged as one of Nobunaga's ashigaru, or footmen, and Ieyasu, originally Ieyasu Matsudaira from Mikawa, was the vassal of a powerful clan known as the Imagawa. The turning point in the lives of all three of the unifiers, and thus for Japan, was at the Battle of Okihazama, when Nobunaga, with Hideyoshi, then Hideyoshi Toshiro, defeated the great warlord Imagawa Yoshimoto, despite being outnumbered 10-1. With the threat from the south eliminated, Nobunaga confirmed his rule as daimyo of Owari and proceeded to subjugate the northern province of Mino, later relocating his capital there, the castle town of Gifu. Hideyoshi adopted the new name of Hashiba and became one of Nobunaga's greatest generals. Ieyasu took the opportunity to turn on his old masters, the Imagawa, and establish himself as the independent daimyo of Mikawa and a valuable ally of Nobunaga. Over the course of the next decade, the murder of a member of the Ashikaga clan precipitated Nobunaga's meteoric rise to mastery over central Japan, acting as the enforcer of the last Ashikaga shogun, Yoshiaki, from 1568. Nobunaga, however, had no interest in serving as a pawn of the shogun, in a way typical of Japan's propensity for shadow government. The most revealing indication of Nobunaga's claim to power is his personal slogan, Tenka Fubu, the realm as subject to the military, coupled with the phrase Nobunaga no Tame, or for the sake of Nobunaga alone. Nobunaga was the realm, and his power rested on military fiat. That is not to say that Tokugawa represented an unbridled despotism while he was alive, and had he lived longer, it is possible that he may have aspired to that. At first, he attempted to rule through the shogun. When the shogun rebelled, Yoshiaki was exiled and lived out the rest of his life as a monk. He then tentatively ruled with deference to the emperor, enthroning Emperor Ogimashi in the castle of Azuchi, which gives its name to the new post-Ashikaga era. Nobunaga, achieving the rank of Minister of the Right of the Imperial Guards, failed to pass this title or any title of significance on to any member of the Oda clan. His ambivalence or even admiration of Christianity was juxtaposed with his infamous posture towards the Buddhist monasteries, who Nobunaga treated as a major obstacle to his military unification of Japan. His destruction of the 8th century monastery of Enyakuji and everyone inside was far from an isolated incident. It is possible that his actions against the traditional pillars of Japanese political and cultural life contributed to his vassal Akechi Mitsuhide's dramatic about-turn, where his retainers betrayed and surrounded Nobunaga at Hanojiju, leading to Nobunaga's suicide by seppuku in one of history's most surreal anticlimaxes. Hideyoshi was quickest to exploit the chaos, eliminating Nobunaga's betrayers and eclipsing the Oda family, whom he nominally served. Ironically, Nobunaga's prioritization of Tenkafubu, rule by military power alone, paved the way for the ascension of this non-entity, with no samurai lineage to speak of, to the complete unification of Japan. By 1590, Hideyoshi was master of Japan, forging for himself a personal mandate for rule in appealing not to the legacy of the shogunate, but to the Fujiwara regions. He fabricated an elaborate genealogy connecting himself to that family, while acquiring the title of Kampaku, or regent, and the clan name Toyotomi as the final evolution of Hideyoshi. Achieving what Nobunaga could not, he ensured that his upstart dynasty would survive him in rule by passing the rank of Kampaku to his infant son Hideyori, while Hideyoshi assumed the title he is most famous for, Taiko, or retired regent. With Japan now united under his rule, he broke the ladder he had climbed from obscurity to total power, formally demarcating class ranks in Japanese society, an inflexible hierarchy. The most notable example was that of the Hai no Bonri, the separation of the warriors from the countryside. By this measure, samurai could not work and were assigned to life in the local lord's castle town or for watch and garrison duty. For Hideyoshi, this cemented the loyalty of the local lords to him by enforcing measures to ensure the loyalty of their own local retainers. Furthermore, by limiting the remit of the samurai, they could not simply fade into the countryside and resort to banditry or fraternize with the locals and precipitate a potential revolt. With a daimyo monopoly of violence, these measures were accompanied by the sword hunt, the disarming of the peasantry. All these measures strengthened Hideyoshi by strengthening Japanese feudalism. The issue remained of controlling the lords in this feudal structure. especially as Hideyoshi had done away with the shogunate, as the shogunate was linked with the most exalted warrior lineage, something that Hideyoshi could never claim. Rather than remain at peace and risk the newly united lords turning on each other, Hideyoshi directed the lords to invade Korea. Here it is important to return to Ieyasu. Ieyasu Tokugawa had retained a remarkable level of autonomy, unique for an ally of Nobunaga. After Nobunaga's defeat, Ieyasu and Hideyoshi quickly came to blows before Ieyasu recognized the overlordship of Hideyoshi. The two families later intermarried. After the subjugation of the Kanto region, Hideyoshi ordered Ieyasu to transfer his control of the strategically important domains around Mikawa, close to Kyoto, to him, in return for the newly conquered domains of Kanto. At first glance, this act was a severe demotion for Ieyasu. Ieyasu was shunted away from the center of power to relocate to a freshly conquered and thereby potentially hostile region. The Kanto Plain was, however, one of the richest regions in Japan. Moreover, the liquidation of the previous clan, the later Hojo, meant that Tokugawa had in effect a blank slate to impose a new loyal administration. Establishing himself in the heart of the plain at Edo, Tokugawa set to work draining swamps and constructing Chiyoda Castle, the nucleus of the modern imperial palace of Japan. By the time of Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu was the most powerful daimyo in Japan. Crucially, Ieyasu's relocation to the Kanto periphery had spared him from involvement in Hideyoshi's disastrous Korean campaigns, which served to drain the manpower and resources of Tokugawa's rivals. Before coming to the Battle of Sekigahara, it is important to reflect on one of Hideyoshi's most lasting achievements, the Japanese equivalent of the Doomsday Book, the Great Taiko Land Survey, to assess tax contributions to be made by each lord. Pre-modern Japan had never established an effective monetary currency. Well into the Tokugawa period, local domains such as Tosa and Shikoku, the smallest of the four great islands of Japan, had their own local currency. Instead, land productivity was converted into the more reliable unit of rice measurements, or koku. In an agrarian society, land productivity was a far more stable means of measuring the wealth of Japan's provinces than a debased currency. Total rice production, or kokudaka, as a means of determining the wealth of individual daimyo, combined with the sword hunt, which made tax collection much easier, provided one of the foundations of the later Tokugawa shogunate. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, power was nominally vested in a regency for the young Hideyori. The last years of Hideyoshi were marked by increased paranoia directed outwardly at Christians, resulting in the first great martyrdom in 1597 in Nagasaki. Hideyoshi's irrationality, combined with his megalomania, cost him a favorable settlement of the Korean campaigns which would have ceded the south of Korea to Japan. Though perhaps most significantly for his legacy, Hideyoshi ostracized and then executed his nephew and adopted heir when he finally produced a son of his own, leaving the new house of Toyotomi at the mercy of the recently subjugated daimyo of Japan. Into this vacuum came Tokugawa Ieyasu as the most powerful daimyo and the non-samurai Mitsunari as representing the interests of the young regent. The two coalitions, Ieyasu representing the lords of the east and Mitsunari, the west, clashed at Sekigahara in 1600. Ieyasu was the unquestioned hegemon of his coalition, whereas Mitsunari suffered from his lowly bureaucratic status and was unable to provide effective leadership to the great host of samurai. Despite this, the battle was only decided when Kobayakawa Hideaki defected to Ieyasu. The battle eliminated a host of rivals to the Tokugawa, some 87 families, while the most prominent clan, the Shimazu, retreated to the Isle of Kyushu. 2 years later, a contrite Shimazu came to Tokugawa to offer his loyalty. Through Shimazu's submission, a supreme Ieyasu accepted the title of shogun, head of all the military houses of Japan in 1603, thus beginning the Tokugawa shogunate and the 250 years of peace. Though, as with the first two unifiers, Ieyasu contended with the spectre of illegitimacy. Hideyori was still alive, and his great castle at Osaka, the most advanced in all Japan, was swelling with defeated anti-Tokugawa partisans. The next move by Tokugawa to cement his rule, paradoxically, was to abdicate. By abdicating after only 2 years as shogun, Tokugawa was free from burdensome ritual to deal with the threat posed by Hideyori, while Tokugawa's son, Hidetada, became the second Tokugawa shogun. This marked the first peaceful transfer of supreme power in centuries and ensured the Tokugawa dynasty would last. As for Hideyori, Tokugawa confiscated his lands and then laid siege to Osaka Castle on an incredibly flimsy pretext. Tokugawa feigned a truce to start filling in the moats of the castle before leading to a final assault in 1615, which culminated in the suicide of Hideyori and of his mother. Tokugawa died the following year, his legacy secure as the auspicious founder of a great dynasty. The Tokugawa inherited a complex feudal system, consolidated by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then refined it. And here I'm going to be reading a rather lengthy excerpt on Jansen on the particularisms associated with Japanese feudalism. In considering the shape of territorial disposition, it is clear that the Tokugawa arrangement grew organically out of what had gone before. The Kamakura and Ashikaga shoguns had worked with and through the administrative and territorial patterns laid down by the imperial court, and they had structured their own house band and retainers into existing administrative units, after which they squelched attempts by aristocratic and temple networks of Kyoto to retain control of the assets within their realms. Of the unifiers, Nobunaga had been ruthless in removing clerical and administrative interference with his activities, while Hideyoshi had done his best to co-opt the prestige of the court through his assumption of court titles. Ieyasu's first move, as shown in his instruction for the court nobility, were to keep them out of warrior politics, and in a short time he managed to hamstring the Kyoto establishment in such a way that it was probably less effective in terms of real power than it had been since the 7th century. The vassal bands that the Sengoku unifiers developed were far more intimately a part of the clan structure than their predecessors had been. Hall has observed that throughout the history of Japan, there has been this alternation between familial and bureaucratic structures, and that with time, each took on an overlay of the other. In Tokugawa Japan, this reached a high point. A fictive family terms came to cloak most relationships of status dependency, fictive family terms being the overriding domination of the Tokugawa house in all affairs. The house, or the E, was everywhere, the enduring unit, and all obligations were subordinated to its preservation. This was not limited to the warrior class in the 17th century. In the 17th century Japanese countryside, large households, staffed by subordinates with varying degrees of bondage, were everywhere. The principal tenants or servants were classed as feudai, hereditary. Below them, a network of lesser orders with varying degrees of indentured bondage looked to their immediate superiors as representing a quasi-paternal presence. Those who lived alongside such networks were outsiders, perhaps of equal rank, but inhabitants of a different universe of relationships. In contemporary Japan, this lives on to some degree as the non-Asian outsiders, or the Gaijin, move in their own and distinctive orbit, forever different. Translated to the world of Edo feudality, this brought a distinction between the traditional Tokugawa house vassals, the feudai daimyo, and the tozima, or the outside lords. Some had opposed the Tokugawa forces at Sekigahara, while others had been cooperated, but as heads of completely distinct systems of subordination and command, they could never change their classification. What was true at the high level of daimyo was even more so at the level of the ordinary samurai. Daimyo could interact, compete, and rank themselves in relationships to the shogunal hegemon, but their vassals lived within a world structure around the daimyo. The categories of Feudai and Tozima thus served to separate the Tokugawa house from its peers. Tokugawa house vassals could serve in the bakufu meaning the central administration of the Tokugawa shogunate, while Tozima were forever cast outside of it. To this must be added the fact that some daimyo houses retained and even treasured long-standing resentment of defeat. In Chosu, the Mori suffered sharp reductions in territory after the defeat at Sekigahara, and one can imagine the deep-laid hope for future revenge, particularly among the lower ranks, whose members might have fared differently in different times. Craig reports a Chosu tradition in which on the first day of the new year, domain elders and inspectors appeared before the daimyo to ask, "Has the time come to begin the subjugation of the bakufu?" and received the ritual response, "It is still too early. The time has not yet come." A second aspect of the daimyo system, as it crystallized during the Edo period, was the precision of its ranking. A daimyo was defined as a feudal lord enfeoffed with an area assessed at the level of 10,000 koku or higher, and directly invested by the shogun. This was a crucial distinction. Many vassals of daimyo were invested with subfiefs larger than that, but they remained rear vassals, or baishin, and moved in their daimyo's orbit and not the shogun's national galaxy. A distinctive aspect of each galaxy was the way in which assessed koku income, kokudaka, status, rank, and military power as expressed in the army size or vassal band coincided. The kokudaka figure was based on domain surveys conducted at the beginning of the period. It was termed the official or outer yield of the domain. As time passed, that might be less the real or the inner figure of productivity, but it remained the measure of status rank, because to alter it by bringing it up to date would involve restructuring the daimyo's standing relative to that of his peers, and hence involve rearranging the whole system. And I'm going to talk about the implications of that in particular later on. That standing determined everything from the location and size of the yashiki, the daimyo's Edo residence, and particularly its entrance gate, to the entourage of samurai he could bring with him to the capital, the audience chamber or gallery where he would be seated in the shogun's castle, and where he would line up with his peers. In short, his quality as a feudal lord, as demonstrated by his conspicuous consumption. It was no less important to his retainers, since it provided the basis for their self-esteem too. It also mattered to the Edo townsmen and merchants who had access to the handbook of heraldry, the daimyo bukan, which listed the feudal lords, their principal vassals, their kokudaka, their heraldry and insignia, the size of their entourage, their mansions, and schedules of their rights of homage to the shogun. For all, this was highly relevant to the commercial dealings of the daimyo samurai, and provided, so to speak, their aristocratic credit rating. Officially, however, two other ratings for lords were used, one related to the size of the domain. If it incorporated an entire province, the daimyo was a kokushu, or province holder. He would also be close to that of a quasi-province holder. Similar conditions came to apply to whether the domain included a castle or not. Postage stamp-sized principalities often did not. Consequently, considerations of provinces and castles, each made flexible by the possibility of the future gradations, quasi or having the status of, provided instant indicators of ceremonial importance. An additional index was that of rank in the ancient 9-step hierarchy in the Japanese court had taken over from China in the 7th century. The Edo Bakufu, however, had seen to it that the court would steer clear of aristocratic distinctions that were so dear to warriors trying to better themselves. In 1606, it ordered that it alone, the Bakufu, could petition for court rank and titles for warriors. In doing so, it manipulated the lists greatly to the advantage of the Tokugawa house and its affiliates. Then in 1611 and 1615, it went on to order the deletion of warriors from court rosters. Warrior officers and ranks were to be distinct from those of the court nobility. By 1680 and after, the highest ranks were largely closed to any but Tokugawa houses. It now became possible to examine the divisions of land according to categories of daimyo. One additional category of shogunal retainer, hatamoto, bannermen, were of sub-daimyo level, but invested separately. They were to play an important role in staffing the bakufu bureaucracy. Shoguns made modifications as they promoted favorites and penalized others. Shogunal lands totaled an equivalent of around 7 million koku, approximately 1/4 of the entire national total. If to this one adds the almost 10 million koku in the feudai daimyo lands, the overwhelming predominance of the Edo bakufu is clear, the feudai, of course, being those in close alliance with the Tokugawa. A geographic balance of power made this possible. Each of the most productive plains of the central island of Honshu was in Tokugawa hands, and the major feudai vassals and Tokugawa-related collateral houses controlled the access routes to Edo. The Kanto plain itself was in the hands of Tokugawa sub-daimyo houses, most of them bannerman or hatamoto. The great Tozima houses were to be found in the west and the northeast, to some degree in the periphery of the country. Land set aside for the imperial court, whose 137 noble families were also assigned a koku income, were around the old capital of Kyoto. Interestingly, the distinctions between feudai and tozima were also used to some extent within the court families. But this overview does little to indicate the crazy quilt pattern of holdings. The outside lords, who numbered about 85, had large areas. Their lines had been established by Sengoku times, some even earlier, and they agreed to Tokugawa leadership after Sekigahara. The greatest of them, the House of Maeda in northern Kanazawa, was rated at over 1 million koku, second only to the Tokugawa house itself. Of the 16 largest daimyo holdings, all but 5 were tozima. Of those 5, one of the greatest of the feudai was the House of Lee, and the other 4 were Tokugawa collateral houses. In all, only 16 daimyo ruled lands assessed at more than 300,000 koku. In contrast to this was the prevalence of petty, postage stamp-sized domains among the feudai, who numbered about 145. Most of them were without even a castle town, and were close to the definitional limit for a daimyo of 10,000 koku assessed. The coastal areas of the Nagoya Plain shows this in startling clarity. Its territory was a sandy spit of waterfront land. Although highly developed as resort country today, in Edo times its productivity was negligible. Even its high officials lived in relative poverty. Nevertheless, Tawara, as the domain was called, was still fortunate compared with many of its inland neighbors, whose lands were isolated spots surrounded by those of the other daimyo. On the Kanto plain, the holdings of the hatamoto were frequently so mangled that villages might be divided between 2 fiefholders. Hence, although feudai outnumbered the tozima by almost half, and hatamoto certainly outnumbered the feudai, in no case did their individual kokudaka, or total equivalent koku, approach that of the major tozima daimyo. To complicate things further, the bakufu lands were widely scattered. The bakufu also frequently allocated or requisitioned land for one or another infraction, and ordered neighboring daimyo to take the burden of running them on its behalf. It is not without reason that Wigan has coined the term of parcelized sovereignty for the Tokugawa system. The Tokugawa house began its rule under the domineering presence of Ieyasu until his death in 1616, by which time Hidetada had already been shogun for a decade. The decisions that mattered until then were Ieyasu's. Hidetada, historians conclude, was his choice as successor not because of his brilliance, but because he could be considered careful and cautious. These characteristics indeed almost cost him the succession, for he was late in arriving to the Battle of Sekigahara, with his army having waited to besiege a castle that he could have easily bypassed. Ieyasu was reportedly so incensed that he refused to meet with his son for some time thereafter. Once he was shogun, Hidetada showed less sensitivity to court and imperial wishes than his father had. He insisted on placing his daughter, Kazuko, as consort for the emperor. A daughter who took the throne as Empress Meisho was born of this union and became the first empress to reign in many centuries. At the birth of the child in 1626, Hidetada and his son Iemitsu, who had already succeeded him as shogun, journeyed to Kyoto, where they made lavish grants of gold to nobles and townsmen alike. Ieyasu had left the bakufu with an equivalent of 6 million ryo, the basic gold coin of the realm, in its coffers, but that surplus did not long survive him. Iemitsu, the third shogun, was also the first to be born as a putative successor, a fact that many account for his overbearing attitude toward the daimyo. Once he had freed himself from the restraints of his father's advisors, he surrounded himself with personal friends. He was a harsh, self-centered autocrat with the feudality, but he also tried to communicate with ordinary people by going on hawking trips alone. Informality of that sort would have been unthinkable by the time of later shoguns. Under Iemitsu's rule, bakufu institutions took on the form they would retain until the end. At the time of his death, 5 of his senior aides accompanied him in a ritual suicide, a procedure that was later banned. Once a shogun was invested by the court, he was absolute ruler. During his minority, there might be a regent, and after he reached maturity, he issued orders through bureaucratic institutions that developed, but in theory, there was nothing that could restrain him. The more important, then, that he be tutored in the merits of virtuous government in his youth. By Ieyasu's provisions, shogunal successors were to be chosen from the 3 great cadet lines of Owari, Ki, and Mito if a shogun failed to produce an heir. Yoshimune, the 8th shogun, added 3 additional cadet lines from which successors might be chosen. In the nature of things, shoguns kept a wary eye on those houses from which competitors or successors might come, and heads of cadet and collateral houses seldom, if ever, found it possible to receive appointments of national significance. The shogunal councils were staffed by Tokugawa vassals, at the highest levels of the feudai daimyo, and below that by bannermen. There were a total of 15 Tokugawa shoguns. In accordance with the primogeniture tradition that had been firm in Japan by the time of the Ashikaga, the shogun was to be succeeded by his eldest son. At the very end of the Edo period, the importance of blood over ability was emphasized by a Tokugawa vassal in discussing a succession choice. The peace and order of the nation are due to the dignity and virtue of the great shogunal family, not just the relative intelligence of any individual shogun. This is the custom of our empire, different from that of other countries, most notably China. But youth and adolescence in the pampered interior of the Chiyoda castle was not likely to provide effective leadership. Moreover, after a successful assassination attempt on a high official in 1684, steps were taken to make the shogun and his top officials less approachable. Guards saw to it that chamberlains, pages, and personal attendants were the only ones able to approach the great leader. This began a period in which chamberlains became central. Thereafter, unless the shogun was a person of unusually strong personal determination and presence, jockeying for influence between heads of bakufu councils and personal advisors characterized Edo politics. It is notable that in almost every case in which a shogun really counted, he proved to have come from the top through irregular outside channels, through adoption, and not through birth, youth, and adolescence in the great interior of the Edo castle. To a remarkable degree, this was true in daimyo houses as well. Innovative and strong individuals were usually adopted into the main line. Not only that, the shoguns who made a difference frequently had mothers whose plebeian origins refreshed the Tokugawa bloodline. Consider 2. Tsuyonoyoshi, the 5th shogun, presided over the so-called Genroku era from 1688 until 1704, which stands as a turning point in Japanese culture, and enjoyed a 29-year rule as an arbitrary despot. A son of Iemitsu and grandson of Ieyasu, he was probably the most scholarly inclined of all of the shoguns. Tsuneyoshi was nevertheless ridiculed as the Inakobo, or the dog shogun, for his misguided edicts he issued to protect animals in an effort to promote compassion. He was a major sponsor of Confucian studies, and during his rule, the Edo court became a scholarly center of studies of Chinese and of Buddhism. He was also notorious for his easy favoritism. He showed handsome young pages, many of whom he promoted to daimyo if they pleased him. Sonya Yoshi's mother was the daughter of a Kyoto greengrocer. When her father died, she went to serve in the household of a court aristocrat, after which she was sent as a lady-in-waiting to the women's quarters of the shogun's castle. There she came to Iemitsu's attention and bore him a son, the future shogun. Since he seemed unlikely to succeed to rule, Tsuneyoshi was appointed daimyo of Teitabayashi, and he continued to live in Edo to be tutored in Confucian learning. One elder brother committed suicide, and when the other shogun, Ietsutana, was on his deathbed, Tsuneyoshi was brought in from a bedside adoption and a succession to the rule. Thus, in this case, birth from a plebeian but highly intelligent and famously beautiful mother and an independent upbringing that was not geared for heading the Bakufu produced a strong-willed, intelligent, albeit idiosyncratic shogun. Yoshimune, the eighth shogun, provides an even better case. By any measure, he was a major shogun, perhaps the most important after Ieyasu himself, whose achievements he tried to emulate. He reacted against the luxury and corruption of the Genroku age by limiting himself and his staff to 2 meals per day. He tried to restore martial values in his samurai corps. Concerned about the overflow of precious metals and foreign trade, he inaugurated programs of agricultural experimentation, including pharmacopoeia from China. An avid student of Chinese institutional history, he sponsored studies of Ming Dynasty law, set about revising the calendar, and did his best to import military and technological knowledge from China and from the Netherlands. He tried hard, and with some success, to free himself from the conventions that had developed to keep the shogun in the recesses of the palace during most of his waking day. Yoshimune's lineage on his father's side was impeccable. He was a great-grandson of Ieyasu, the third son of the daimyo of the Key Cadet House. His mother, however, was of townsman extraction. She became a lady-in-waiting, no doubt because of her beauty, but she was so low in rank that she was not even permitted to rear her son. Since there seemed little likelihood of promotion for the young Yoshimune, he was given a petty fief with a paltry rating of 2,000 koku, a fifth of that of any daimyo. So insignificant that he had difficulty in meeting the ceremonial requirements of his court rank. Then, following the deaths of his 2 elder brothers, he emerged as the daimyo of Ki, suddenly eligible for succession to the shogunate. Thus, a fortuitous pattern of illness and premature death in Edo and within his own paternal family made it possible for him to be appointed as shogun or regent, and from that post he was able to maneuver support from the senior counselors for his elevation to become shogun. He represents another instance in which commoner blood, combined with unexpected mortality rates in high places, made it possible for a relative outsider to come to rule and exert a powerful political presence. At the beginning of this presentation, I spoke of Confucianism as a means of self-cultivation. Consequently, the Japan of the Edo period extolled the arts of peace. One can say that the heart of political life was expressed through the Sankin Kotai, the system of alternating attendance in the capital. What began as a way to ensure compliance through keeping hostages from prominent families in the shogun's castle grew into something akin to Louis le Grand's Versailles. Chiyoda Castle was witness to annual displays of submission which confirmed the supremacy of the House of Tokugawa. To flaunt this ritualistic submission carried with it the penalty of disposition through a severe curtailment of your koku rank. Submission, paired with a demonstration of rank, though conspicuous consumption, at once elevated Japan's great houses and bankrupted them. Money spent on ritualistic display was money not being spent on fortifications as samurai retainers that could threaten the central authority. All the while, with these elaborate and highly choreographed set of residences within Edo itself, all of these powerful nobles suddenly became that much easier to control and observe. An army of occupation in peacetime, forbidden to work and representing some 6% of the population. By the early Tokugawa period, the samurai were falling from the exalted way of the warrior, or Bushido. Perhaps the greatest expression of samurai morality, the Hagokuri, was written at a time where the martial values of the samurai were appearing obsolete after the victories of Ieyasu and the beginning of the Great Peace. Bushido, I have found out, lies in dying. When confronted with the alternatives, life and death, one is to choose death without hesitation. There is nothing particularly difficult. One has only to be resolved and push forward. While some say death without gaining one's end is but a futile death, such a calculation, such a way of thinking, comes from conceited, citified Bushido. Pressed between two alternatives, one can hardly be sure of choosing the righteous of the two. To be sure, everybody prefers life to death. He tends to reason himself into staying alive somehow. But if he comes out alive without gaining his righteous end, he is a coward. Therein lies a crucial point to consider. Conversely, as long as one's choice is death, even if he dies without accomplishing his just aim, his death is free of disgrace, although others may term it as a vain or insane one. This is the essence of Bushido. If one, though being prepared for death every morning and evening, expects death at any moment, Bushido will become his own, whereby he should be able to serve the Lord all his life, through and through, without blunder. In the absence of the seeking of death free of disgrace, samurai life came to take on a different character. Perhaps the greatest caricature of this era, at odds with this very notion of a sincere samurai morality, is that of samurai indiscriminately cutting down peasants who fail to demonstrate the proper respect. There is an act of dubious provenance referring to this right of kirisute gomen, or license to cut down, which is attributed to Ieyasu himself, though Ieyasu would then go on to punish samurai who used peasants for katana practice, and the punishment would be the death penalty. The Great Peace, as following from the acts of Hideyoshi, relied on the separation of the samurai from the peasantry. While there is no doubt that peasants were killed during this time by samurai, the structure of Edo society was predicated on preventing such fraternization. To be entirely cynical, if the license to cut down was indeed legally legitimate, Ieyasu probably intended it as a means of offering these neutered samurai a phantom sense of importance in the absence of a real martial role, while drawing the line between samurai and peasants even further, a form of divide and rule. Far more interesting to consider is the Confucian bureaucratic scholar-warrior hybrid of the Tokugawa era. The fact that Bushido achieved its greatest literary articulation in this period is a consequence of this fusion, which no one in the 7th century could have anticipated, that of the warrior administrator. They were also known as the Confucianists, or Jusha, an intellectual elite corps that served prominent advisory roles to many daimyo and to the shogun himself. Seldom were samurai well off. Despite representing the upper echelon of Tokugawa society, samurai were often poorer than peasants, artisans, and merchants, unless they were lucky enough to own their own estates. Thus, samurai were in a unique position to serve as scholar administrators, forbidden to work in fields which were considered beneath them, with no independent income, retainers to a lord, and beholden to his magnanimity, operating within a culture that prioritized loyalty above all else. This economic status went hand in hand with the anti-materialism of Confucianism. Peasants were ranked higher than artisans, as the role of a peasant as farmer was necessary for everyone's survival. The artisans produced useful things, though not as essential, whereas the merchant who produced nothing were considered parasites. Only beggars were lower than merchants in Tokugawa society, to the point that they defied any categorization. The daimyo themselves would profit from the advice of their warrior administrators to be lauded as sage rulers, or maikun, exemplars of Confucian practice. Within the Bakufu itself, this was represented by a burgeoning bureaucracy that fluctuated between 10,000 and 20,000 members, with its own rigid hierarchy and supervised by a system of elders and a grand elder. It should be noted, however, that the scale of the Bakufu bureaucracy was small, even in relation to the shogun's personal series of armed retainers, and Japan remained essentially feudal throughout the existence of the shogunate, though a feudal system with certain elements of bureaucratic life. Nor was this education restricted to the elites. Education of the elites resulted in a better crop of elites, and education of those under the elites resulted in a clarity of understanding within a Confucian framework that associated education with pacification. With the proliferation of the printing press, again from the Chinese invention rather than the Western invention, urbanization and access to education, pre-Meiji Japan was an era of mass literature, with a literacy rating comparable to that of England or France in the 19th century. Tokugawa Japan began as a nation of around 15 million people, with three great urban metropolises, Sakai, later to be amalgamated with Osaka, Kyoto, and Edo. Edo was the residence of the shogun and the de facto capital of Japan. Kyoto was the capital of the emperor, and Sakai was the largest merchant entrepot, virtually removed from the interfactional struggle of the samurai, as if it were a Hansa republic within the Holy Roman Empire. By the 18th century, there was only one great metropolis, with a population over 1 million people, the city of Edo, now one of the largest cities in the world. The Sanken Kotai, the alternative attendants, had established the political centrality of Edo. But what began as something closer to a Mongol court city, sarai or karakorum, with all the martial orders assembled in glorified tents, later became opulent residences, quickly developed as a major commercial center. The population of Japan, too, had risen to some 40 million by the 1850. The population of Japan, it would be wrong to assume, represented some sort of Malthusian extreme on the precipice of some great national calamity. Indeed, there were famines and natural disasters, notably from the 1780s onwards, yet Dutch observers would remark that even the peasants in Japan looked prosperous. In his bid to unify Japan, Oda Nobunaga had removed internal customs barriers and private watchtowers that divided the domains to stimulate commerce. This legacy continued into the Tokugawa era with the maintenance of the Bakufu-run national highways that linked the country to its capital commercially, while originally intended to facilitate the Sanken Kotai and to quickly dispatch troops to deal with rebellion. By the time of the third shogun Iemitsu, there was a significant Christian presence in Kyushu, with many samurai, even daimyo, converting to Christianity and leading a deputation themselves to the Pope in Rome. Nevertheless, the first measures against Christianity were undertaken by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1587. Hideyoshi would later develop a paranoia of Christianity, ironically fueling later missions of the Franciscans after the original missions of the Jesuits. Ieyasu took a pragmatic approach to Christianity. In the wake of the war with Korea, Ieyasu had no desire to repeat the mistakes of his predecessor, and instead focused on domestic peace and international détente with China and Korea. Korea eventually permitted one avenue for trade through Busan via Tsushima, whereas a Chinese quarter, the Tojin Yashiki, was eventually established in Nagasaki. While subduing the castle of Osaka in 1614-15, Ieyasu was committed to a total pacification of Japan and ruled against further missionary activity and conversions, and ordered Christian converts in Japan to formally apostatize and swear loyalty to the Tokugawa. Ieyasu had reason to mistrust the daimyo who had converted, believing that Portugal and Spain, which were at this point united as a dual monarchy, were attempting to implement a divide and rule policy in Japan as a preamble to invasion. Many of the samurai who had converted saw Christianity as a means of ensuring greater cooperation and trade with the West, and so quickly apostatized when the risks began to outweigh the benefits. Genuine converts, often peasants, however, did not apostatize. Ieyasu was faced with the conundrum of the benefits of trade versus the threat of international subversion. Iemitsu was able to find a solution to the conundrum. Portugal and Spain were in the process of decline as a result of the rise of the English and Dutch empires. The Dutch, in particular, were prepared to offer Japan trade with no prospect of Christian missionaries. Letters intercepted from the Spanish Philippine capital in Manila only seemed to fuel Tokugawa paranoia that Spain and Portugal wanted to conquer Japan. With the positioning of a viable alternative in the Dutch, ready to replace the Portuguese in a purpose-built foreign quarter in Nagasaki, Deshima, a major revolt broke out against Ieyasu and his increasingly despotic behavior, which ultimately coalesced into a Christian rebellion. The revolt provided the ideal pretext for the elimination of Christianity in Japan. In the aftermath of the rebellion, peasants were given minted images of the Madonna and Child to ritualistically stamp on as a sign of devotion to the traditional values of Japan. The Portuguese themselves were expelled in 1639, while the Dutch were settled in Deshima, forbidden to leave save for a ritual humiliation as an extension of the Sankin Kotai. Upon the arrival of the Dutch mission to Nagasaki, Christian literature was confiscated for the duration of the stay. Meanwhile, Japan refined a permanent class of counterintelligence agents, the Metsuke. Combined with the Office of Counterintelligence, Buddhist temples became associated with the state in an unprecedented fashion. Peasants were organized into what amounted to temple dioceses to service the spiritual needs of the Japanese subjects, while temples deferred in authority to the shogunate, akin to a Japanese Buddhist Church of England, with mandatory church attendance and a common catechism or article of faith. While the Buddhist establishment allied itself to the state, a friction arose between the Confucian, Shinto, and Buddhist establishments. While it would be a mistake to view the emperor as the pope, to which he was often compared by Europeans, with the final word on doctrine, when everything for the emperor, even permission to visit his gardens, was mediated through a permanent shogunal liaison. This system was not uncommon, rather it was the norm of 17th century Europe. Within the Holy Roman Empire, princes operated under the principle of Caius Regio, eius religio, the prince determining the religion of his own principality, though the empire had hundreds of princes of Catholic and various Protestant denominations. In France, this principle was utilized through the Edict of Fontainebleau that receded rights to French Protestants or Huguenots. Yet this demonstration of power and the ruler's ability to determine the religion of his subjects was achieved through an absolute monarchy in France. Tokugawa Japan achieved what Louis XIV of France achieved, but to a greater extent, with no pope to answer to, while retaining a patchwork quilt political system that better resembled the religiously fractured Holy Roman Empire. Sakoku, the era of closed borders in Japan, is a byword for bigotry, backwardness, and is often a convenient excuse to explain away Japan's original inability to confront the mission of Commodore Perry that opened Japan. This attitude is both Eurocentric and simplistic. In relation to its neighbors, Japan was comparatively the most open, especially when compared to the Hermit Kingdom, Korea to the north, and even China, where its Jesuit missionaries were to some extent assimilated into the Confucian literati. The Dutch trade missions demonstrated that Japan, under the Tokugawa, was a sovereign nation and would not countenance ideological subversion or unequal trade. The ritual humiliation of the Dutch in Edo was the clearest expression of this, and arguably the situation benefited the Japanese far more than the Dutch. For the Dutch, their Javanese colony in Batavia could boast exclusive access, however meager, to the Japanese market. For Japan, the Dutch represented a mirror to the wider world, a source of both useful political information and new technologies. While Confucianism, in part spurred on by the Chinese quarter, enjoyed an intellectual renaissance during the Edo period, fascination with the Dutch was represented in foreign studies, or rangaku, in a way that completely eclipsed the curiosity of Japan's immediate neighbors. And Japan's subsequent preparedness in dealing with this threat from the West can be explained by this. The greatest weakness of the system, with hindsight, was the Japanese decision to prioritize the Dutch as their sole trading partners, a second-rate force by the 19th century over the English, later British Empire. When describing a system of feudalism perfected, It comes with a necessary fatalism over the transitory nature of all man-made systems, regardless of how glorious these systems were at their zenith. Though the case of Japan warrants more praise than all other instances of feudalism within my own experience. In 1588, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had 31 daimyo pledged to guarantee the lands of the court and nobility, thus binding court, daimyo, and himself into a formal polity based on reciprocal personal obligations, the kogi, that expressed the common interest or the common weal of Japan. With the demise of Hideyoshi, the bakufu came to represent and uphold the kogi, this common interest of the estates as one, including that of the imperial court. The shogun's authority, especially under Iemitsu, as displayed through its public proclamations or kusatu, appeared as near absolute in the Tokugawa's ability to regulate and reorder Japan at whim. By the 18th century, the emphasis returns to this binding affiliation between all the parties and the preservation of land rights in particular as some form of feudal consensus. By the late 18th century, the Koku quotes for a country in which the population had doubled since the last review was seriously out of date. Yet this was to the betterment of the system, not its detriment. Regions were on the whole more prosperous, while being taxed less. In order to conduct a new review, the shogunate needed a bureaucratic apparatus to conduct a review that simply did not exist, and the willing consent of its subjects to be taxed more. Such consent did not exist, so rather than force the issue or expand the bureaucratic administration, the bakufu adjusted to the new balance in relations between the periphery and the center. In Europe, constant wars provided the impetus for centralization, yet as of the 18th and 19th century, such impetus in Japan did not yet exist. Thus, decentralization occurred organically, and deference to the center was based on precedent, but also to an extent inertia rather than fear. The crisis of the Tokugawa shogunate appeared, however, before the arrival of Commodore Perry, through an unfortunate succession of natural disasters and crop failures, in particular during the 1830s. The failure of the reforms of the shogun Tempo gave an overall impression of government impotence and paralysis. This also demonstrated the abilities of the decadent and abdicated shogun Ienari to frustrate the process of earnest reform. The crisis precipitated the rebellion of Oshio, a disaffected Confucian scholar, and this is taken from his manifesto. To the village officials, elders, farmers, peasants, and tenant farmers in the domains of Setsu, Karachi, Izumi, and Harima. From the time of the Ashikaga, the emperor has been kept in seclusion and has lost the power to dispense rewards and punishments. The people, therefore, have nowhere to turn with their complaints. If the four seas suffer destitution, the benefices of heaven cannot survive. We who are confined to our homes find it no longer possible to tolerate the existing conditions. We lack the power of King Wu, a famous sort of mythical ruler of ancient China. We do not have the virtue of Confucius or Mencius. For the sake of all under heaven, knowing that we have no one to depend on, and that we may bring on punishments to our families, those of us who are like of mind are resolved to do the following. First, we shall execute those officials who torment and harass those who are lowly. Next, we shall execute those rich merchants in the city of Osaka who are accustomed to the life of luxury. Thereafter, as soon as you hear that there is a disturbance in the city of Osaka, mind not the distance you must travel, but come immediately to Osaka. What we do is to follow the command of heaven to render the punishment of heaven. For Oshio Tokugawa, society was being rocked to its foundations. The kogi, or common weal, was under threat. Officials were mired in corruption. The nation was approaching a state of decadence. Natural disasters were thus a symptom of the loss of heaven's mandate in the Chinese way, more than the roots of national debilitation, which they probably were. While it is certainly true that the Tokugawas were ill-equipped in dealing with these natural disasters, they were just that, natural disasters, and not self-inflicted wounds such as Hideyoshi's invasions of Korea. The Tokugawa lingered on, past Commodore Perry's ultimatum, for another decade. It is possible that the system could have survived under, quote, normal circumstances without the shock to the system of what really amounted to an alien invasion. The greatest, you can say, distinction between the technologies of the West and that of the old world, or in this case, Asian civilization, the comparison I think of is very much that of pre Columbian America interacting with the conquistadors. Here, however, and to first reference the idea of Oshio and turning on the mandate of heaven, I need to take this idea of the mandate of heaven and turn it on its head and show how Japan differs, but moreover, how the perfect storm of the Meiji Restoration was a consequence of Tokugawa munificence in their feudal order. In China, the imperial system survived through various iterations, dynasties that would typically exterminate the previous dynasty. Japan had an unbroken chain of emperors and empresses from the House of Yamato that continued to reign, if not rule. Right, so sorry, I've completely lost my place. Right. As executive power was usurped. Imperial and shogunal power reached its nadir in the 16th century with the impoverishments of both figureheads. The rise of Nobunaga proved a boon to the material, if not the political situation of both factions, and the emperor was necessary in providing for the legitimacy of the Tokugawa shogunate. The closest thing to a Chinese succession of dynasties was that of the siege of Osaka Castle and the elimination of Hideyoshi's heir, Hideyori, as a threat. Under the Tokugawa, the imperial court, with its associated court families from the Fujiwara clan and others, were enriched and represented a considerable soft cultural power. In supporting the emperors, the Tokugawas could ensure a permanent mandate, while court life and the resurrection of antiquated and copious levels of ritual ensured that emperors remained aloof from political life. In true fashion as a descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, the emperor offered radiance, light, and life to the shogun, while the shogun could expect that the emperor's actions to be as predictable as the passage of the sun in the sky. To ensure this, everything the emperor did was closely monitored and stage managed. Coupled with this were the Tozima, the defeated faction from Sekigahara. In the aftermath of the battle, the Mori clan was relocated to the pitiful domain of Chosu, as previously stated, while the Shimazu retained control of Satsuma province. Those who had opposed the rise of the Tokugawa were reconciliated, not eliminated, yet were held in constant low esteem and suspicion by the victorious party, forever operating on the periphery of power. For the Mori, such humiliation was cause for a 2 centuries long vendetta against the House of Tokugawa. The Shimazu, however, engaged in political marriages. One such family was that of the House of Kono, a cadet branch of the Fujiwara clan of court nobles to the emperor. Thus, a firm dynastic link was established between a powerful, disaffected samurai elite whose province of Satsuma boasted the highest concentration of samurai in the country, with the only power in theory higher than that of the shogun. The perfect power of opposition was thus petrified, lying dormant for an appropriate crisis. Ironically, then, the Tokugawa system was able to provide a solution from within without recourse to revolution, after the Bakufu itself had failed. Though further elaboration on this and the Meiji Restoration will have to wait for another day, and it's here where I'm going to end my presentation for this evening, and all I can say is thank you very much, everyone, for watching. I'm just going to go over and review the super chats if there have been any. So thank you, everyone, thus far for listening. All right. Okay. The first super chat from 21st Century COTYK for £2. Full spectrum weeb dominance. Oh dear. I actually want to know, because I want to know what qualifies a weeb. Because I really don't know. Is it just someone who watches anime? I really don't know. But this has been a political history. I haven't really talked about the samurai other than the social implications of being a samurai. Um, Unoriginal username for £1.79p. Thank you very much. Unable to watch live. Love the channel. Well, that's unfortunate. Unoriginal username, but thank you for sending a super chat regardless. I hope you enjoy it when you come back to it. Right. Aristocratic Owl for $5. Can't say, but can you please go into more detail about what makes the shogunate administration the perfect feudal state? Well, I did go into quite a lot of detail, but in essence, it is maintaining a structured sense of tradition all the way from the seventh century, not overriding these traditions or creating some sort of overlay with these bureaucratic administrative practices or the rise of managerialism. So as a way of achieving a long peace with, you can say, minimal state activity by having a strong society which is heavily structured, hierarchical, stratified. At the same time, we're talking about the fundamental idea of sovereignty and the idea that Japan was able to retain its fundamental character and was able to counteract foreign subversion. And it was able to do this throughout the entire duration of the Tokugawa shogunate up until the 1850s. And also, you have to put this in contrast with the other European systems I mentioned, such as Germany, to a lesser extent, Italy, and France, which is the exemplar. I really do believe that the shogun within his territory, ironically, held more authority within Japan than that of the king within France, given the power of the Catholic Church and the Pope. And I also interested in this idea of Buddhist integralism, or this idea that the Shinto Confucian Buddhist hybrid represented some form of sort of religious scholarly bureaucracy, which was also a counter bureaucracy because we're not talking about a post feudal society, which equated to some sort of Japanese equivalent of the Church of England. I find this idea very interesting. And again, with all of these ideas of perfecting feudalism, this is superlative feudalism, or the best example, because you cannot create or contrive of a perfect system of feudalism because it relies on idiosyncrasy. And I think Japan is, in this case with the Tokugawa shogunate, it is just one giant idiosyncrasy. Yet all of these things create a delicate balance of power which just works. And that I find fundamentally fascinating. And it doesn't rely on some form of sort of surrender of sovereignty or collapse of the social order. It's a hierarchy. It's a system of class relationships, mutual reciprocity. That, of course, I mentioned feudalism as a perfected system. Again, it's almost meant to elicit sort of hostility from the audience because, as I point out, feudalism and perfection are a contradiction in terms because it runs completely counter to this idea, to the idea of the Enlightenment, basing a society on reason, getting rid of everything and restructuring everything about this abstract and almost holy concept of reason. So I want to take the idea of perfection and I want to actually try and demonstrate it within an organic political system as opposed to some sort of bizarre, contrived utopia, if that makes sense. Right, aristocratic owl again for $5. Then also, have I often heard, I assume, that Japan is the Britain of the East. Could you explain further why some people would think this about Japan? A couple of things. You can conceive of Japan as representing the Britain of the East if you think of China as representing the entirety of continental Europe. Then I think there is some sort of claim to that. Britain is inheriting the ideas of continental Europe, but it's fundamentally switching them up in a very sort of superficial way. And the closest example I bring to this is the idea of state Buddhism and English supremacy over the church. But again, in Japan, we have this idea that we have a cultural national head in the form of the emperor, and then we have a military dictator who actually runs everything. Again, this is fundamentally unique the system of Japan itself. There is also the naval angle to consider. If you look at pre-Tokugawa Japan, you have to look at the Waku pirates, and you can perhaps say that the Waku pirates represented some tenuous link to the privateers of Sir Francis Drake, etc. The difference would be, however, that the Waku pirates were basically entirely autonomous, had their own pirate havens, and they didn't have a central machine to incentivize privateering against the Spanish, as with the Court of Elizabeth in London. So there is a tentative naval link there. You also have to consider that during the late 19th century and the 20th century, Japan came to represent a great maritime empire. However, it was a maritime empire based on values which were completely anathema to that of Britain. Indeed, you can say part of the raison d'etre of Japan post 1931 is the idea that we are going to be the anti-Britain. We are going to be destroying Western influence and the conception of the British Empire within all of Asia, stretching from everywhere from Hong Kong to the British Raj. So I think it's a flawed comparison, and I believe it has to be done in little compartments. Juan Kigaron for $2. Thank you very much. Does AM have a favorite clan? Well, it's I'm not quite sure how to qualify that in terms of my own sort of personal interest, irrespective of everything sort of I put forward in this. I'm actually most interested in the Fujiwara noble court dynasty. Right. Lord Kelvin for $5. The Meiji Restoration, the Nanban and its consequences. Which consequences in particular, Lord Kelvin, are you referring to here? Like I said, I may complete this with a part 2, which would be a Meiji Restoration series, because that's how I sort of wanted to end it. Right. King Scott for £5. And someone in the chat is saying the Obama clan. Yeah, I think you've been playing, what is it? Shogun 2 Total War. Right, where is it? Okay. Where did the artisans and merchants fit into the system exactly? Did the daimyo have authority over them? Well, this is interesting. When we're thinking about the daimyo and his authority, we're talking about principal administrators over a castle town in which the samurais represent the individual retainers, whereas the merchants are mainly confined to the great sort of urban metropolises. They don't feature into such a great part of village life, and even within village life, the category of peasant is highly diversified. It's not just everyone is living in poverty or everyone is sort of stuck to these manorial strips like we see in West. Japan had a high degree of kulaks equivalent, or that of sort of yeoman farmers, well-off peasants, etc. And many of these peasants were richer than samurai, who were entirely dependent on their relationship with the lord. The most interesting thing I think about this example and trying to compare it to Europe and contextualize Japanese history is trying to view cities such as Sakai, which will ultimately amalgamate into Osaka, as almost like these merchant republics existing within a kind of like a Holy Roman imperial structure, which was the Japanese Bakufu, albeit in Japan, it was far more successful than we see in the late Holy Roman Empire. So in this case, the merchants did represent a high degree of autonomy. It's also important to note that the merchants in many ways perfected fundamental aspects of Japanese sort of court culture, such as the tea ceremony. In fact, it is this link which is fundamental for the cultivation of the arts under Oda Nobunaga, his relationship with the merchants of Sakai. But of course, Edo is an entirely new phenomenon because Sakai had existed pre-Tokugawa Shogunate. It was like an oasis of merchants, and then as a result of Sankengotai, we have an entire industry based on the ritual subjugation of all the daimyo, creating a major urban metropolis in Edo, which becomes one of the largest cities in the world. It's not just, we're not just talking about sort of merchants and artisans. We have to also think that there was a a large red light district, one of the largest red light districts in Edo at the time. And this also led to a lot of moralizing and talk about decadence in the late Tokugawa period. But again, this is also a consequence of having so many samurai around who aren't doing much, those who aren't becoming effective bureaucrats or scholar administrators, etc. Right. Chiario Scuro for £10. Thank you, AM, for this excellent and educational stream. Well, that's very kind of you, Chiario Scuro. Thank you very much. Jacob for $10. You said land value was measured in terms of rice yields instead of a currency. Do rice paddies need crop rotation to avoid soil degradation over time? Seeing the value of rice would deflate otherwise. Well, this wasn't a constant value of rice yields. It wasn't done on an annual basis. It was done once, Jacob. It was done once before the Tokugawa Empire during the Great Land Review of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and it could never really be done again, because had it been done again, then all of the daimyo in Japan would have their ranks redressed and changed, because it almost relied on a fixed system based on this fantasy system of the productivity of the land. So ironically, doing it in currency would have probably been easier to change the system, but arguably that would have actually made the system worse. Um, adding complexity and difficulty into the system of review, like I said, it allowed, while the territories were becoming more prosperous, it also meant that everyone was being taxed less. So it represents some form of Japanese decentralization, supply side economics, etc. So um, it worked again, weirdly. Um, the absence of a central currency, and again, it's a fascinating phenomena relating to it's a fascinating phenomena relating to Japan in particular. The idea it was never able to perfect fiat currency, while China was pushing out banknotes. Um, the sort of equivalent I'm drawn to is the fact that, say, for example, pre-Columbian Peru, the Incan Empire, never invented the wheel. So instead, you have these incredible highways across the Andean mountainscapes, where runners would be able to cross over from one side of the the Andes mountain range to another. Um, it's You could say it's a source of innovation, compensating for, you can almost say, in the West, we consider everything needs to be standardized in a certain fact. We have to rate things in terms of fiat currency, or we have to rate it based on the state of bullion or silver or gold coinage, etc. Whereas in Japan, they were able to do it effectively with rice. And as you say, Jacob, with a one-time fixed value, which couldn't really be changed without uprooting the entire system of administration, which is why I think it's fair to call it the Japanese Doomsday Book. Lady of Shalott for $5 Australian. Thank you very much. Wonderful lecture. I voted for this topic, and I am not a weeb. How is Nobunaga viewed in Japan today, given his slaughter of the Buddhists? Um, like I said, Lady of Shalott, I don't actually know what qualifies a weeb. It's a term I've been subjected to seemingly endlessly since I put out that poll. And I still don't have a adequate, satisfactory definition of what a weeb is. If it's someone who's just interested in Japan, then I guess I'm a weeb. I don't know. I really don't actually care. Nobunaga, I think Nobunaga. There was a fascinating TV series which is produced by the Japanese equivalent of BBC, albeit the Japanese equivalent of BBC is better, called The King of Zipangu. I think Nobunaga is perhaps the most well-known of all of the three great unifiers. Um, and I think it is because he almost represents this pure demonstration of military fiat, military force. He is the closest thing we see to a revolutionary in this period, someone who is purely Machiavellian, purely considering everything in terms of power relations. He destroys Buddhist temples, not because of precedent, not because of their history, tradition, whatever. That's all meaningless to him. All of these are simply there to augment power. He builds the Azuchi Castle, one of the greatest castle towns um, in Japan, to demonstrate and augment his power and to represent a flowering of this new Azuchi era culture. Yet, at the same time, he deposes the shogun. Again, he becomes a master of the tea ceremony and he destroys Buddhist temples. I think, again, it's something that even contemporaries of his couldn't understand and were threatened by this arbitrariness, this again, I would characterize that the most perfect systems of autocracy are based under a system in which the sword of Damocles is hanging over everyone. And I think this goes quite a ways to explaining why Akechi Mitsuhide turned on him and resulted in his death in the Hanojoji incident. So I think he's endlessly fascinating. If anything, he's still an enigma. And I think, of course, because he had this completely anticlimactic ending, there's a great what if scenario as to what would have happened had he gone on and completed the unification personally. Um, Yes, and someone in the chat is mentioning the eco-wiki. Well, as you can tell, this presentation was already quite long as is and went into quite a lot of detail. And I think talking about the eco-wiki would have complicated things immeasurably. And I think it would have to be for a Sengoku specific stream, really, to talk about that. But it's interesting I'm talking about Ieyasu. The figure I find by far the most interesting is actually Hideyoshi, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. If anything, he's the figure I'd want to do a biography on if I had an option of the three unifiers. Right. Polish ambassador, was it more on absolutism or Spartan dual monarchy? It wasn't as rigid as Spartan dual monarchy, albeit like Spartan society, it had a much greater propensity of peace than its reputation would give. Um, but in terms of dual monarchy, who would be the dual monarchs in this case? Are you talking about the emperor and the shogun as representing some sort of tandem authority? Because that's definitely not what happened. Um, as for absolutism, like I said, there are absolutist trappings. There are various elements of superficial absolutism, but it's painting over something that was fundamentally feudal, which is why I find it fascinating. Um, like in France, you can almost say that the creation of Versailles was a demonstration that the House of Bourbon had won. Whereas the same thing exists for Chiyoda Castle for the Tokugawa with the Senkin Kotai, the alternative attendants, but all the people who were defeated, the main sort of factions who were defeated, the Mori and the Shimazu, retained that institutional power base, which they never did in France. Also, a large part of achieving absolutism for Cardinal Richelieu was the elimination of the Place de Sûreté. And these systems remain. These consistent castle towns are the equivalent to the French Place de Sûreté. So, no, it remains fundamentally feudalistic, albeit you can draw comparisons with what happened in France under Louis le Grand. Right, that's it for the super chats. So I'm going to go back and see if there are any interesting questions that have been asked. I'm going to try and make it a 2-hour stream. So I'll be here for 15 minutes, if that's all right with everyone. And I'll try and answer the questions that I actually sort of I can actually answer. Right. Right. Sorry, I'm passing over questions relating to the Wacko Pirates because frankly I just don't know. It's not my area. One of the Catholic diarmos retreated to the Philippines and was beatified, a saint by Pope John Paul II. Well, yes, there was also a mission by the daimyo of a northern province known as Date, who was trying to. It's possible he was trying to gain support from the papacy and the Portuguese Spanish dual monarchy for some form of intercession, some form of political intercession, as in there was an intensification of persecution in Japan after the year sort of 1614. Um, but of course, that didn't happen, and this is all just, uh, if anything, like I said, the fascinating thing about the Tokugawa is they won absolutely, and they were able to dictate their relationship with the outside world on their own terms. The only thing you can really fault them over that is the fact that, like I said, they opted for the Dutch over the English. And I think there was a particular paranoia associated with the idea that the English king called himself the defender of the faith. The Japanese saw that and indicated that he had some sort of divine mission to spread what was then Anglicanism um, into Japan, albeit to call sort of the British Empire as it emerged a fundamentally Christian enterprise is faintly ridiculous. Right. Oh, another super chat. Um, the Fujiwara deep state would be a fascinating topic to cover. Retired emperors with more power than sitting emperors. Well, just talking about the Fujiwara dynasty, I mean, Prince Kono was one of the most influential sort of uh, early Showa um, or Hirohito era prime ministers just before Tojo becomes prime minister of Japan. So the Fujiwara clan has a very long arm in terms of its historical reach from the 7th century until the 20th century, and they're still around today. It's quite interesting mentioning the idea of female emperors or reigning empresses, um, because Japan has a strict system of morganatic anti sort of morganatic marriage and male succession, exclusively male succession. Until recently, there was actually a succession crisis regarding the termination of the House of Yamato. Regarding the Heian period, yeah, well, the Heian period is fascinating. The reason I don't rate it like I rate the Tokugawa period is that the Heian period is also a period of transformation. What began as an imitation of Tang dynasty China became this origin point for personal rule, whereas the Tokugawa shogunate retained its essential character from the beginning up until the end. The difference is we see, you can say, the transition from awe, fear, absolutism, inspired by the person of the shogun, towards a model based on consensus. And indeed, this, in terms of relaying this back to France and the idea of the honitete, the idea of how one is supposed to interact with the shogun, the idea of isolating him from public view, making him less approachable, all of this has trappings of the same period of sort of 17th century French absolutism as well. In this sense, in the sort of symbolic sense, the Tokugawa shogun becomes a far less approachable figure, and he becomes you can say, the puppet of the various elders and chamberlains who surround the Bakufu administration. But again, in terms of the fundamental relationships between the Bakufu and the nobility, the samurai at large, the relationship, the Tozuma, the feudai, even the distribution of the lands remains the same. Uh, what did it mean for a merchant practically to be at the bottom of the hierarchy? Well, again, i- in terms of sort of materialistic concerns, it didn't really matter at all, because merchants and artisans were able to get very wealthy. Indeed, what is remarkable is that you have an incredibly immobile social structure based on rigid social categorization, and at the same time, materially, the lower orders, just above that of the Chinese equivalent of the Untouchables, are doing better than ever. In terms of access to political appointments, completely sort of below, but below consideration, completely shunted away, only operating within the sort of, semi-republican atmosphere of Sakai and Osaka. So in terms of the right to administration and the proximity to the shogun, it was based on this rigid hierarchy, but in terms of material acquisition, it really didn't matter that much. Again, trying to bring this back to France, we see this similar frustration with an increasingly impoverished nobility and demanding the right to work. The difference is in Japan, the higher families retained a formal and fundamentally important role throughout the entirety of the Tokugawa shogunate, whereas in France there was this paranoia that the nobility would rebel, and so absolutism in France, as opposed to feudalism in Japan, was predicated on a new class of men, the noblesse de robe, merchants acquiring the rank of nobles. To basically enter into the administration of the French king as intendant. And this, of course, would be entirely anathema to Tokugawa society. Right. But again, this is why Tokugawa has to be considered within the context of feudalism and superlative feudalism, and not in terms of Western materialism or later, quote unquote, early modern. I hate using that term, early modern, but everyone uses it, so I have to as well, even though I rebel against it and try and form my own nomenclature as sophisticated as it can be. Right. Do we have any last super chats? You've got me for 8 minutes. Interesting, Lady of Shalott is mentioning random people in Australia knowing who Nobunaga is. Yes, probably Nobunaga might be the most famous Japanese figure outside of the 20th century. Apparently, we have a definition of weeb from Webham Aristocrat, someone who worships Japanese pop entertainment culture, used as a derogatory insult on image boards before it became something endearing. Well, based on my interaction, I don't believe it has become endearing. I might have to disagree with you there. Japanese pop entertainment culture. So is this particularly talking about anime? Or anything more than that? Right. Okay. Yeah, some people are talking about patricians and the association with actors. Well, isn't it all the more remarkable though that peasant women, if they caught the eye of the shogun and became his concubine, could inexplicably produce a next shogun, as it was with Yoshimune. So in terms of social mobility, that's probably the greatest example of social mobility. But even in that case, the women were shunted away, and they didn't say, for example, I mean, compare this even with the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, all the consorts to the Sultan were slaves. All the women in the harem were officially his slaves. And even in that system, the slave women of the harem enjoyed a higher precedence than the temporary concubines of the Tokugawa shoguns. Because as the later Valid Sultan, the woman of the harem who produced an offspring for the Sultan could basically act as the political patron of her son, and would have to maneuver around the other women who had also produced heirs for the Sultan to ensure in a fratricidal succession conflict that the Sultan could then, her son could then become Sultan. So even in Ottoman society, you have a point where slave women, Hurrem Sultan is the greatest example of this, and Khosem Sultan, etc., could become the leaders of Ottoman society. Of course, that didn't happen in Japan, even with the appearance of reigning empresses. Right. All right. Dual monarchy as per formal distinction from the start that keeps the kings to military and religious ceremony while administration was taken from them. While are you referring back to the system of administration within Sparta. I understand that I think almost the closest example to the Spartan king would be a Roman consul. Um, it was originally conceived that the shogun had that role as the northern barbarian subduing generalissimo, and his rank came as a temporary rank from that of the imperial court. Or you can say it's even greater than that of a consul, and it could probably approximate the Roman title of a dictator. But of course, this became an institutional hereditary rank, and for any system of absolutism, the last thing you want is the creation of hereditary offices, because signaling hereditary offices all of a sudden means that you don't have that authority anymore. It is a purview which you have no sort of right to delegate, to restrict certain powers, etc. All of a sudden, you have been usurped, and that was the case with the Japanese political system in all of its various manifestations, from the personal rule of the Fujiwara through to the Kamakura and later the Hojo regents, the Ashikaga shoguns, and of course the best example of this with the Tokugawa shoguns. Really, if we're looking at like the Meiji dynasty within the continuation of this, it was replaced by the Meiji oligarchy, who themselves represented a sort of post-samurai elite. And you can say that Japan throughout the 1920s and 30s post Taisho almost represents another form of the Onin War. It almost represents another form of this civil war between competing interests, trying to wrestle, control, and dominate the person of the emperor, who has now been liberated from the restrictions of the Tokugawa shogunate and has assumed a paramount role, which hadn't really been conceived of since the 7th century. All right. I think that's it for me this evening. Thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and leave a comment. It helps the channel out a lot. To see more content like this, subscribe to Apostolic Majesty. If you want to support the channel and gain access to members-only content, please consider becoming a channel member. I also want to add that I've been thinking about this. There's a bit of a milestone for this channel. We just hit 15,000 subscribers, so thank you very much, everyone. In terms of sort of motivating me to finally do my early history of English-speaking civilization, or British civilization, or whatever, which I've termed the Children of Albion. It would sort of be helpful, I think, almost to have like a goal associated with it where I can finally unlock that and start doing it and feel motivated to do that. And I feel that if people go on, they subscribe to this channel, or people help other people subscribe to this channel, whatever, spread the word, etc. If we can get this channel to 17,500 subs, I will guarantee that I will finally get around to doing my my history of the early English from Hengist and Horsa, and I'm thinking about ending it with Edward I, because I really want to talk about Edward I and why I believe Edward I is the greatest king of England. Right. Thank you everyone for watching, and good night.